Good evening, everyone. Science has spoken. Many scientists are arguing right now that California must reach, in fact, the world must reach 100% renewable energy by 2030, not 2045 or 2050. Our climate crisis is now a climate emergency. Dr. Ramanathan from UCSD and a group of other scientists just wrote a paper titled Climate Action California to underline the urgency for action. In the past week or two, IEA and the National Research Energy Lab have released separate reports stating we need 100% renewable energy urgently. Last week, Environment America released, quote, "We have the power." Mark Jacobson, who presented with us a few months back, perhaps you attended, has led and continues to lead the world with his 100% renewable energy research and books. What we need is a clear understanding of perhaps the best ways to move forward and to act. In that context, in the fourth quarter of last year, RethinkX released a report, the Energy Report 2020-2030, of which Dr. Dorr was one of the two authors. And the ideas really impressed me. That's how we arranged the evening tonight. We're really fortunate that he is with us. Dr. Dorr is an environmental social scientist and technology theorist whose current research with RethinkX is focused on the disruption of the global energy sector by new energy generation and storage technologies and its intersection with similar disruptions set to unfold across the economy. He completed an MS at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability and a PhD at UCLA's Luskin School, of Public Affairs, where he studied the environmental policies, politics, and planning around disruptive technologies. He has a decade of teaching experience, lecturing and presenting experience, and wonderful research experience. Dr. Dorr, over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. Is my sound working well? Can everybody hear me?
Excellent.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see the start of my slideshow?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So, well, again, thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to do is talk through the research behind the report that we published in October of 2020. Which is titled 100% Solar, Wind, and Batteries is Just the Beginning. And I hope that that title will come to be meaningful by the end of the presentation here. Our findings were a surprise as much to me as I think to our audience. So this was a particularly exciting piece of research to be involved in. And my co-author, Tony Seba, is an eminent figure in the field of technology disruption and clean energy. And this is an extraordinary opportunity, an extraordinary moment for us historically. We're on the cusp of a truly extraordinary technology disruption. And it comes at a moment when the human need and the social context of that disruption is equally extraordinary. Of course, what I'm talking about is climate change. So what I'm going to do is walk through the research that we did and explain the key concepts that emerged out of that. And then, of course, at the end, I'll be happy to take any questions that anybody has. So let me see if I can advance my slides without any trouble here. Okay. And those are advancing. I know we had some trouble at the beginning. Are my slides moving for everybody?
We can see them, yep.
Perfect. Okay. So solar, wind, and batteries. That's the focus. That's the story as we see it. The technology disruption in the energy sector, which has already begun, is centered around these three technologies in particular. They're not the only energy technologies, but these are the most impactful, the most significant ones in this moment. So what I'm going to talk about is the idea that disruptions historically have often been triggered by not just one technology that emerges, but a convergence of new technologies. And this is what makes disruptions swift and substantial. And we're seeing exactly the same thing in the energy sector today. Not just one, but three key technologies working together, converging to offer a value proposition that is overwhelmingly competitive relative to the existing technologies. And those existing technologies that I'm referring to are, of course, fossil fuels in energy generation, so coal, oil, natural gas, but also nuclear power, even hydropower and other renewables. These are all in the line of fire of these three technologies and their convergent value. So the primary driver of all disruptions is cost. And what we've seen, and I'll show some of the data in a moment, and I'm sure you're familiar, the cost improvements of these technologies has been stunning. It's been spectacular. And it is the cost competitiveness that really drives disruptions, gives them their momentum, and is responsible for the swiftness, the surprising speed with which a new technology or set of technologies can emerge, become prominent, and wipe out the incumbent technologies that can no longer compete with them. And I'll explain some of the dynamics of how and why that happens. Because disruption is primarily driven by cost, when the new technologies become competitive, when they reach parity, disruption becomes more or less inevitable. Historically, we do not see significant permanent obstruction of new technologies that are overwhelmingly cost competitive with the incumbency. This is very good news in the context of climate change. So one thing that we see again and again is that new technologies, if they are overwhelmingly economically competitive, they tend to be unstoppable. We have not seen examples in the past where an incumbent technology is so firmly entrenched and has so much other power beyond just the economic, but social and political power, that it is invulnerable to disruption. We have not seen that, and we have no reason to expect that the energy incumbency of fossil fuels in particular is an exception. In fact, quite the contrary. We think that this fossil fuel industry is surprisingly vulnerable. Now, just because disruption, when it's driven by economic forces, is inevitable, doesn't mean it's inevitable on a specific time frame. It is possible to accelerate disruptions with the right choices, and it's possible to delay them substantially with different choices. So technology alone is not enough, especially when time is of the essence, as it is in this moment with climate change. But what our research shows is that a disruption of the energy sector, in this case, is possible as soon as 2030 in the regions that choose to embrace and accelerate the disruption. And there are other factors involved. Geography is an important factor. But as you might imagine, a place like Southern California has exactly the sort of geography that would make an accelerated disruption possible, and from our perspective, preferable. An important implication, socially and economically, of disruption is that the incumbency will tend to be wiped out and its assets rendered valueless and stranded on a time frame that is usually unexpected. This is not going to be any exception, this disruption of energy. And what that means is coal, gas, nuclear, and other energy assets are very likely to be disrupted over the next 10 to 15 years, and therefore stranded, rendered worthless over the next 10 to 15 years. In this case, because the energy sector is so large, we were talking about a very, very substantial amount, dollar amount of assets, not even necessarily billions, but perhaps even trillions of dollars worth of stranded assets worldwide. So it is important to keep that in mind, the magnitude of this disruption and its social consequences is extraordinary. It's unusual. Other disruptions may happen. Digital cameras disrupted film cameras, but that didn't strand trillions of dollars of assets. So this is something to keep in mind for social and economic reasons. Okay, so with all of that as the background, let me explain why our research shows that 100% solar, wind, and batteries energy is possible. Okay, that's the first thing that I'm going to explain. And I'm going to show that or at least I'm going to explain how our research shows that it's much more widely affordable than is widely imagined. And the reason why that's the case is that when the mix of energy generation from solar and wind with energy storage from batteries is balanced correctly, the quantity of battery capacity that's needed is much less than is widely believed. This is crucial.
He's talking about
The new system that's going to emerge is, as in many other disruptions, larger and fundamentally different than the system that we have today. And I'm going to explain that this is not a problem. This is an extraordinary opportunity. And superpower, as the title of this presentation suggests, is central to rethinking the new system that is going to emerge after the disruption. Okay. Well, let me show you some data here and let the data explain why these disruptions are so compelling. The cost of solar power has fallen dramatically. This is not news to anybody, I'm sure, here, but let me at least put the numbers up. 82% decline in 10 years. This is the cost, the capital cost to construct solar power. It's fallen by 4/5 since 2010. And we project that it's going to fall another 70%, or even a little bit more than 70%, over the next 10 years. Now, this trend is much easier to see when you rescale the data on a logarithmic plot. So on this plot, the vertical axis is now exponential. So when we talk about disruptions being driven by exponential change, this is a perfect example. When you look at the data like this, you can see the consistency with which these technologies are improving. And what we see is that we have every reason to believe that the trend that it's been going on actually since quite a lot earlier than 2010. In fact, all the way back to the 1990s in the case of solar photovoltaics. This trend is very likely to continue. And so the overall picture is that in just 2 decades, the cost of solar power will have fallen by a factor of 20. For wind power, and again, we're talking about a convergence of all 3 technologies here driving the disruption overall. Wind power is similar, perhaps a little bit less spectacular, but nevertheless impressive. 46% cost improvement over the last 10 years. We project another 43% in the decade ahead. When we rescale this to be on a logarithmic chart, we see that the consistency is striking. And that's a 3x improvement in the space of 2 decades. Batteries are even more spectacular. Almost 90% improvement in just the last decade in cost, and another 80% is what we're projecting in the decade ahead. And again, when the data are viewed correctly, when they're viewed on a logarithmic scale, they are strikingly consistent, and for that reason, predictable. Okay. One way that the conventional analyses tend to err is with their technology forecasts projecting linear growth. And this is not what happens. Technologies overwhelmingly grow on a sigmoid curve, an S curve. And the first stage of the S curve looks exponential. This is exactly what we see with these 3 technologies in their market adoption, in their growth. we see a beautiful exponential growth curve for each of these three technologies. These are global numbers. So these data they're striking. They show that there is a clear and consistent trajectory with a decade or more of data behind it, pointing to the decade of disruption that lies ahead. Now, why do disruptions grow exponentially at first and then trace an S curve? Why not linear growth? Well, the reason why is because technologies are driven by feedback loops. So when a new technology emerges, as its costs decline, it becomes more cost competitive, we have more demand. With more demand, that incentivizes additional production, investment. Investment increases supply, and as supply increases, costs are driven down even further. So this is a feedback loop. This is a virtuous feedback loop. But it's not the only dynamic involved. With more demand also comes more infrastructure investment, more government support, and these contribute to the growth of supply as well. As supply grows, the industry gains experience. The capabilities of the technology itself tends to improve. We have the public becoming more accepting and less skeptical of the new technology, and we have the emergence of network effects. So this is a set of reinforcing feedback loops or a virtuous cycle. Now, at the same time, as demand for the new technology is growing, it's corroding demand for the old technology. And so the old technology has a parallel dynamic, but in the opposite direction. Less demand means less revenue, which causes supply to shrink. Shrinking supply drives costs up. And as costs rise, demand falls even further. This is a reinforcing feedback loop as well, but it's a vicious cycle. It's a cycle of decline. And we call this a death spiral when disruption is imminent. Less demand also means less profit, of course. It means less investment in production. It means less investment in infrastructure. And it means less support from the government. All of these together amount to the loss of social license for the technology and the industries that are based on. And I'm sure you've all seen this already for fossil fuels as support, both public and among investment, as these are corroding. At the same time, less supply means public acceptance is declining, network effects are weakening. All these contribute to less demand. And in the center, less demand of the old drives all the more demand for the new. So this is the fundamental dynamic behind technology disruption. And it explains why the growth of new technology and the decline of old technology is not linear. It is nonlinear, and the early stages are exponential. We've seen this time and time again with many different technologies. Growth of the new, decline of the old, and it's a common story. Many different technologies have fit this pattern in the past, and we do not expect solar, wind, and batteries and their disruption of the incumbent energy technologies to be any exception this time around. Okay, one other important thing to note is that disruptions, they tend to continue. The exponential growth phase of the disruption tends to continue until the new technology comprises around 75% of its ultimate market size. So the S curve is not symmetrical. It tends to grow beyond the a 50% market share. This is simply the empirical data speaking. When we look at dozens and dozens of historical examples of disruption, this is the pattern that we tend to see. Now, what's striking about this is a subtle point, but it's an important one, is that the growth of the new technology tends to expand the size of the market. And as a result, new technology can grow exponentially all the way past the size of the old system. So this is an unintuitive finding. It is true, of course, that exponential growth of any kind can't continue indefinitely. It has to level off at some point. But the leveling off, in many cases, comes long after the new technology has eaten the entirety of the existing system and the existing market. We've seen this in many cases. And so what we often point out is that disruption is not one-to-one. It is not a proportional replacement of the existing system. And in any market or example, automobiles did not disrupt horses on a one-to-one basis. They did disrupt horse-based travel, but they kept on growing well past the scale of the horse-based system before leveling off. The same is true, maybe we can pick any technology disruption. I mentioned digital cameras before, so we'll use that one. Digital cameras did indeed disrupt film cameras starting in the mid-1990s, but they didn't just replace film cameras on a one-to-one basis. Many more film cameras entered the market, and the market for digital photography became vastly larger than it ever was for still photography, for films based photography. And so this is surprising, because when you see projections of solar, wind, and batteries growing exponentially beyond the limits, beyond the scale of the existing system, it can seem that might seem at first glance to be impossible. How could you continue growing right up to the limit of the existing system? And the explanation is that the system grows, the new system grows beyond the old one as a function of disruption. Okay. Now, conventional forecasts have gotten this disruption in the energy sector spectacularly wrong. This is the International Energy Agency, the IEA's projections for the growth of solar year after year for the last 20 years. And every year, their projection is a linear forecast. And every year, the growth is exponential. And the next year, there are no lessons learned. So I won't say any more than that. It raises the question: why was a correction in the underlying assumptions behind these forecasts not made sooner? That continue to be made to this day. But at any rate, conventional forecasts fail to recognize the dynamics of disruption and their fundamentally nonlinear nature. And the exponential growth continues to surprise the conventional forecasting community. Likewise, the decline of the existing incumbent industry has taken conventional forecasting by surprise. So this is coal in the United States forecasted by the United States Energy Information Administration, excuse me. Every year, there is a forecast that coal will either grow or recover, or its decline will halt. And every year, the decline is inexorable. And we have no reason to expect that this is going to change. So the conventional projections are fundamentally flawed with respect to disruptive technologies. And it is crucial to remember that, because these two sources that I cited here, the International Energy Agency and the United States Energy Information Administration, these are widely cited in the climate science literature. And we have constructed our climate scenarios and structured a great deal of our policy proposals and our planning on projections that are for technology that are fundamentally flawed. So this is important to keep in mind. Okay, let me talk a little bit now about our research and what we found when we asked the question: is a 100% solar, wind, and batteries energy system possible? The short answer, I won't keep you in suspense, is yes. The details are fascinating. So our research looked at 3 regional case studies. We looked at California, we looked at Texas, and we looked at New England. We chose these regions for their representative geography. Well, California has great sunshine, not so great wind. Texas has great sunshine and wind, and New England has limited sunshine and wind resources. The way we approached our modeling was to look at the existing resources that are in place. We looked at the existing solar energy generation stock that is installed in situ in California, Texas, and New England. And we looked at the onshore wind capacity that is installed in those regions. And we looked at its generation over a 2-year period. This is a different approach than other analyses of this kind have used. So instead of creating an abstract model of sunshine and wind, and then estimating what the generation would be if you built a solar generating facility or a wind turbine, we actually looked at the data coming out of those installations on the ground already. And so this is direct empirical data. This is not modeling based on simulation of solar and wind resources. This is modeling based on actual empirical data of the generation of those resources already in place. And we simply scale up the generation proportionally to what the system would need. Okay. When we did that, we used a systems dynamics approach that combines the solar and the wind generation, and we solved for the quantity of generating capacity that would be required in order to make sure that there were 0 system faults. So we didn't solve for 95% uptime or 99% uptime or 99.9% uptime. We have had 0 fault tolerance in this system. And we asked, okay, what would the battery requirement be with a given amount of solar and wind generating capacity to give you a system that gave you that met 100% of the existing electricity demand in this 2-year period from the existing electricity market, the real market demand that existed. And we did all of this on an hour-to-hour basis. So the resolution of our analysis is hourly. It's not per day, it's not per week, it's per hour. And what this did is it told us which combinations of solar and wind generating capacity paired with a given amount of battery energy storage would give us a 100% reliable electricity system. So we did tens of thousands of scenarios in the modeling. We looked at a large number of combinations of the technologies, and we looked at them in different time periods because the cost changes. So this is crucial. It's one thing to identify a mix of the technology that will work functionally. It's a separate challenge to identify what the least expensive combination of these technologies is that would get the job done. So we did all of these things. We looked at the different combinations of the technologies. We looked at them at different times according to how the cost of each of those will change, because the system, if you were to build a system in 2010, the optimal mix of the technologies would be on a cost basis. The cheapest combination of technologies would be very different than if you were to build the same system in 2020 or the same system in 2030. So this is dynamic. And we ended up mapping out a space of possible systems. Okay. But at the bottom, at the end of the day, the bottom line is we were trying to balance energy storage with energy generation. And when we looked at all of our results, a striking pattern emerged. We found that many different systems would work, many different combinations of solar, wind, and batteries can give you 100% reliable electricity. Many, many different combinations. There isn't just one or a handful. Hundreds and hundreds of combinations are viable, but they're not all equal. Some of those combinations are much more expensive than others. And when we chart the different combinations, according to the amount of generating capacity that they have and their cost, a U-shaped curve, a U-shaped pattern, more technically, a convex cost function emerges. And so what we see here is that there are systems on the one side of the curve that would work, they would be viable, but their balance would be lots and lots of batteries and relatively little solar and wind. And unfortunately, those would be very expensive. On the other side of the scale, at the other end of the curve, you could do the opposite. You could build a viable system that would get you through the darkest, shortest days of winter, and you could build it with relatively small batteries, battery capacity rather, and much larger solar and wind capacity, and that would work. But it would also be expensive. It wouldn't be cost optimal. And what you're looking for is a sweet spot where you've minimized the total overall costs, and that is the point at the bottom of the curve. So the sweet spot, the optimal balance, the lowest cost mix of the technologies is that point at the bottom of what we call the clean energy U-curve. Now, what's striking about this is where that sweet spot is located. This surprised me. I was fully expecting to find viable 100% solar, wind, and batteries systems. That I was expecting. I was not expecting that the lowest cost, the most affordable, the cheapest combination would have an extraordinary property, and that is that system would have much, much more generating capacity than today's electricity grid. Where we found it for the 3 regions that we looked at, and we've subsequently looked at several other countries as well, and confirmed the same findings in those countries. The general location of the sweet spot at the very bottom of the clean energy U-curve is where the generating capacity of the system is about 3 to 5 times more than the capacity of today's grid. And what I mean by that is the nameplate capacity, installed capacity. Another way you could think about that is the peak capacity that the system is capable of generating. Now, this is a fundamentally different kind of electricity system. Today, we build the electricity system to have only just enough capacity to meet demand. In fact, in some cases, not quite enough. And as a result, the system that we have is not 100% reliable. The new system, the system that would emerge if you optimized the cost of solar, wind, and batteries, would have much, much more inherent generating capacity, 3 to 5 times as much as our current system does. And I'll explain in a moment what that means and what the connection to that and what we call superpower is. I'll explain that in a moment. But let me explain, just before we go there, why this is the cheapest system. Well, the reason why is because the batteries are what is so expensive. Right now, batteries are still very expensive. Even in 2030, where our analysis optimized for, the batteries are still costly. And so it makes sense to identify a mix that has relatively small battery capacity compared to what the current expectations are, right? So this is very unintuitive. This is surprising. If you'd asked the scientific community just a few years ago, how much energy storage do we need? How much battery storage do we need to support solar and wind, a system based on solar and wind and other renewables? You might have got an answer of something like, well, we need weeks worth of batteries. We need a month worth of battery storage. Now, that's not true if you assume that you can build more than just what would be 1x or 1.5x generating capacity here on this chart. if you assume you can build much more solar and wind capacity, if you assume you have no reason to stop building solar and wind capacity, you can slash the battery energy storage requirement. And what we found is that the optimal mix, the lowest cost mix system in these regions only requires 35 to 90 hours worth, just a couple of days worth. More in New England, no surprise, and less in California. So this was an extraordinary find. Looks like my slides repeat there. Sorry about that. Okay, so what would this cost? Well, here's the stunning thing. Not only is the cheapest solar, wind, and batteries combination, that sweet spot at the bottom of the U-curve, not only is that the cheapest combination of solar, wind, and batteries that you can build, it is hands down, by far, the cheapest energy system that you could build. It's a fraction of the cost of what would be required to construct a reliable energy system with fossil fuels from scratch, for example, or nuclear power. And this is a stunning finding as well, that not only is it possible, and not only is it affordable, but it is also by far the cheapest system that we could build. Now, because our system has to turn over, because we have to replace our energy generating capacity over time, it only makes sense to replace it entirely with solar, wind, and batteries. Assuming no other fundamental cost breakthroughs in other technologies like nuclear technology. But for right now, nuclear technology is very expensive. And so it's no contest. Solar, wind, and batteries is the cheapest option, in addition to being perfectly feasible, if you build the right combination, the right mix of the technologies. What we found is that in California, a 100% solar, wind, and battery system, the system mix at the bottom of the U-curve would cost $115 billion. In Texas, it would cost $197 billion, and in New England, $91 billion. So when we extrapolate that to the country as a whole, we see a total price tag of under $2 trillion for 100% solar, wind, and batteries, 100% clean energy, and it is by far, hands down, the cheapest energy system that we could build. And let me show you the specifics for California. This is the modeling map for California. This is a picture of all of the scenarios that we did. I don't even know if you can see the little white dot in the middle, so I'll circle it in red. That was the single optimal system. That's the one at the bottom of the curve. And here is California's U-curve. So this is the actual data, not a stylized graphic of the concept. This is, oops, that's not sticking. At any rate, this is California's clean energy U-curve. And we find that the optimal system would have about 4.5 times the generating capacity of today's system. Now, let me mention a couple of things here. We did not make this a rosy situation. We did not make this easy for solar, wind, and batteries. We employed some severely constraining assumptions on our analysis. We did not allow any electricity imports. So California doesn't get to import electricity from any of its neighbors if it gets clobbered by bad weather, for example. It has to be entirely independent. Same with the other regions that we looked at, even New England. No benefiting from clearer skies in neighboring regions that can share their electricity generated with their solar capacity as need be. So no electricity imports. No distributed energy resources whatsoever. So no rooftop solar, no distributed batteries, none of that. That changes the situation dramatically as well. No electric vehicles to either drive demand for batteries or to provide a what would be called a virtual power plant to provide battery capacity to the grid. None of that. We excluded all of that from the analysis. No energy arbitrage, no demand shifting. These are ways to flatten out the demand curve and buy electricity when it's cheap and use it when it's expensive to save money. None of these smart grid approaches to being more efficient with the use of electricity in order to reduce the generating capacity requirements. None of that. We followed exactly the existing demand patterns. We did not build in an emergency reserve based on fossil fuels. In other words, no leaving 10 or 15% capacity in natural gas peaker plants in reserve to save the day in the event of a severe storm or another weather or geography related challenge. The batteries had to have enough capacity to make it through any challenge without leaning on the legacy technologies in emergencies. Now, that's not necessarily realistic. We may not want to build the system that way. It may be that it's worth keeping a couple of these older plants available for, a 24-hour emergency once every few years, because that could save an enormous amount of money. But we didn't allow that. We didn't assume any technological breakthroughs in any of these technologies. No cold fusion or fusion of any kind, nothing like that. No amazing new batteries, supercapacitors, none of those sorts of breakthroughs. We didn't allow any subsidies, no carbon taxes to help finance this or to artificially lower the cost. And we did not factor in any infrastructure changes. So this is, if all of these were to be accounted for, the feasibility of the system would only increase and its cost would only come down. Okay, so that's the clean energy U curve and our findings about the system being affordable. Let me quickly explain to you an extraordinary property that the new system will have that is so exciting, which is what we call superpower. Superpower is the term that we use to describe the surplus of energy, the surplus of electricity that this system will have the capacity to generate by virtue of the fact that it is built to get through the worst times of the year, those cloudy, short days in the winter. When you build the system to make it through those tough times, then all of the rest of the year, the capacity is available to produce a surplus. Now, this is not just in sunny regions. We even found that in New England, superpower would be available on the majority of all days, 2/3 of all days. And in sunny regions like Texas and California, well over 90% of all days have some superpower generation, some ability to generate a surplus of electricity beyond the demand of today's market. Okay, why is this so extraordinary? Well, what's extraordinary about it is that electricity, because it's primarily coming from the sun, most of the superpower would be produced by solar, some from wind, but most from solar. The extraordinary thing about solar power generation is that its marginal cost is very close to zero. So solar panels, once they're in place, they just sit there and they happily make electricity when the sun is shining. And whether they make more or less doesn't affect in any substantial way the cost of the electricity. So making more electricity or less electricity, there's no fuel cost, there's no additional maintenance, there's no additional wear and tear on the equipment. So the marginal cost, the cost of making an additional electricity, an additional unit of electricity, an additional kilowatt hour, is very close to zero with solar power. And what that means is that all of that superpower, all of it, will have a marginal cost of it's effectively zero. Now, another way, a less technically correct, but perhaps more profound way to think about it is that superpower is free. So what could we do with an enormous amount of near zero marginal cost, effectively free electricity from this system? This system that would be the cheapest system, the cheapest electricity system we could build. Well, the sky's the limit. We could use it for all kinds of things, for desalinating water and treating water, because energy is the great water challenge, right? We could electrify all of transportation and have plenty of energy to spare. We could electrify commercial and residential heating, or a large portion of it. We could electrify waste processing. We could electrify industry that's particularly energy intensive. These are just a few examples. There are many other examples of what we could do with extremely low marginal cost electricity. So let me show you California. This is the existing electricity demand in California, 285 terawatt hours of demand. Okay, so a 100% solar, wind, and battery system, the one at the bottom of the U curve, the sweet spot, that system, the lowest cost one, it would meet all of the existing demand, 285 terawatt hours. And in addition to that, it would generate another 309 terawatt hours of superpower. So the superpower would be larger than the existing, existing electricity demand in California from this system. So here's how that compares to the energy demand converted into terawatt hours, the energy demand in the transportation sector today in California, the residential sector, the commercial sector, the industrial sector. Okay, you can see that superpower has a tremendous potential role to play here. Okay, but the story doesn't end here. Let me show you one more very exciting, really quite thrilling finding. This was the eureka moment for me in this research. When we put two key ideas, superpower and the clean energy U curve together. Okay, this is my favorite finding of this research. It really was a thrill to discover this. Okay, and it is subtle, and it's not obvious. So that was one reason why the discovery was so thrilling. So just as a reminder, that sweet spot, that point at the bottom of the curve, that would be the lowest cost system that we could build. But let's do a thought experiment. What would happen if you decided to spend a little bit more money to go even further, to keep building solar, wind, and batteries, or in particular, solar and wind? That would move you on the U curve. So let's say, oops, I'm sorry. Let's say we built an extra 20%. Let's say we spent 20% more on our solar, wind, and battery system. What would that do to us? What would that do to the system that emerged? Well, because the U curve is not linear, it would have a profound impact on the generating capacity of the system. For an additional 20% investment, we could move ourselves up the curve. We would end up with a system, depends on the geography, on the region, with 50 to 100% more energy generating capacity. So instead of 4x, something like 6x or even 8x generating capacity, but the system would only be 20% more expensive because that would reduce the battery requirement even further. Now, here's the exciting thing. What does that do to superpower? It's nonlinear. So superpower returns on that 20% investment would be enormous. In some regions, it would double the amount of superpower that that system would generate for just an additional 20% investment. So let's bounce back to this side. What happens to California with an additional 20% investment? You double the amount of superpower. And suddenly you're talking about enough electricity to electrify the entire rest of California's economy, or very nearly. So this is absolutely stunning. This is extraordinary. Okay, so if electricity were that inexpensive, a whole new world of possibilities emerges. We could repatriate some of our manufacturing, including the manufacturing of solar, wind, and batteries. We could bring some of that back if energy were cheap enough. We could achieve many of our other goals. We all know about these. Energy availability, energy abundance is central to human development, and clean energy, in particular, energy that doesn't come at a human or an environmental cost, would absolutely turbocharge our pursuit of human development. And this is simply one schema for understanding human development, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but there are many others. But this requires no real elaboration. With an ultra abundant clean energy system, it would make achieving other human development goals much more feasible. So at this point, the only question to ask is, how soon can we get started with this? What can we do to accelerate this? So with that, I'll wrap up and say thank you. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. I hope I didn't go too far over time. I probably did. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm thrilled about this research. I think it's extremely important, and the implications for California and the rest of the country and the rest of the planet are extraordinary. Thank you.
Dr. Dorr, you did great on time, so thank you for that. Joe, do you want to lead with the first question?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. That was it's just awe-inspiring. Let's assume that we wanted to bring superpower initiatives to San Diego County. First question is, what steps does the county need to take to implement superpower and to reach the the 120% investment that you talk about to really provide extra energy?
Well, that's a fantastic question. It is the question to ask, and so let me first, before I provide what insight I can on that, let me first provide the politician's answer to that question, which is that it's the right question to ask, even though even if we don't have exact answers to that question, it is the right one to ask. The important thing is to ask the right questions. Every region is going to discover, every region within the states, especially California and the very large states, regions are going to face different challenges. They have different geographies. They have different social, economic, political contexts. There's no one size fits all answer. So the important thing, the crucial thing, is to ask exactly the question that you just posed. So that's the first thing. But setting aside that slippery response, let me offer a couple of pieces of specific insight that's emerged out of our research. Okay. A couple of enabling conditions would serve to accelerate the disruption. One is, and we are planning on publishing some research on this later this year, energy rights would make a very big difference. Today, we do not have the right to generate, store, and sell electricity as individuals or as other entities, as companies, as firms, as organizations, as community groups, as nonprofit organizations. We do not have the set of rights in the energy sector that we take for granted in other parts of our lives. And so that would be an important first step, which would be to pursue the guarantee of energy rights so that we can open the door to the emergence of a new system that has solar, wind, and batteries deploying at every scale, from the individual all the way up to the grid and everything in between. And if we do that, then we can benefit from the power of the market. We can benefit from economic forces. We can use the power of economic forces to our advantage to give us a tailwind on this on accelerating the disruption. So that brings me to the next response, which would be there are crucial roles for decision makers, for policymakers and investors in accelerating the energy disruption. For governments, we need to focus on less on research and development, which continues to be part of the discussion in the energy sector. We need to focus less on that and more on deployment. Deploy. We have the technologies we need. If we have $10 billion to spend, it is much better to spend that deploying solar, wind, and batteries than continuing to research more speculative and exotic energy technologies that are likely to lie far off in the future. Now, I would never say that no research into new technology of any kind, or fundamental research, and especially energy research, is required at all. But nevertheless, I would say that we need to be careful. We need to be cautious about where we dedicate our finite resources. And what we can see very clearly is that there's enormous bang for the buck to be had for investing in deploying solar, wind, and batteries immediately. So getting governments and investors to focus on deployment is crucial. there are a number of obstacles that are in the way of deployment, and governments can help with that, certainly. Break up the monopolies in the energy sector, that would clearly be a first step. Right now, the incumbency in the energy space does have control. They have a substantial amount of control. They have the ability to obstruct the deployment of these new technologies. They certainly do. And if they had less power, and if they were in a situation where they had to face competition from these new technologies at different scales, not just at the grid scale, but also at smaller scales, then that would accelerate the disruption. And policymakers have a key role to play there. I'll stop there. That's. I'm sure there are more questions. I could speak, for a very long time answering any of these, but and I can elaborate on that. But I'll stop there for now, if just to make sure we get other questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dorr. So I have a question here that Mark W. asked, and then Johnny asked similar, and that's about the lifespans of solar and battery. And then I wanted to tag on to that. Did you consider the natural resource constraints of keeping with this system, especially knowing that electric vehicles are also in contention for those same lithium batteries?
Yep, those are great questions. So let me address the longevity question first. One way that the incumbent and conventional analyses tend to frame the new technologies, especially solar and batteries, wind less so, but especially solar and batteries, is to suggest that they only last a short period of time before needing to be replaced. And the data simply don't support this in stationary applications. From everything that we can tell, solar panels work just fine for at least 40 years, and probably more like 80 years or 100 years. Now, they do lose some of their initial efficiency as time goes by, but that loss of efficiency tends to occur largely in the first decade or so, and then level off, so that after 10 or 15 years, something like that, it varies according to the exact type of solar panel, but after some period of time, the original efficiency of the panel will be down a bit. So and typically the numbers that we're seeing for very old solar panels that were built 20 or more years ago, their efficiency remains 75 to 80% of their original capacity. So if you had a 1 megawatt solar installation, 20 years in the future, you could expect it to be an 800 kilowatt, generating capacity facility. But here's the thing. The operating costs of solar are so low that it's difficult to foresee a situation when it would make sense to throw away that resource, right? A solar panel that works 80% as well as the day it was brand new is still an extremely valuable asset. There's no point. There's no rational case for removing it unless you absolutely have to have an extra 20%, and you must put the solar panels in exactly the same place as the original ones, say on your roof, for example. But in most applications, it's simply not necessary. You'd be very happy to have solar panels chugging along at 75 or 80% of their capacity indefinitely, which is what we're likely to see. Now, what happens is if you redo the calculations on cost and assume that the panels are going to last 40 years or 50 years instead of just 20, suddenly they look a lot more competitive, right? You can imagine. So this is something to watch for, to keep an eye out for in conventional analysis. Similar situation with batteries. It's true that lithium-ion batteries, in particular, the current lithium-ion battery chemistries, can degrade over time. But the way that the batteries are used has an important impact on their longevity, and the specific chemistry. There are many different types of lithium-ion batteries that affects their longevity. When they are used in grid applications, as opposed to the way we use them in our smartphones, or the way we use them in an electric car, where we're charging them all the way up and draining them all the way down, and having huge power surge demands on the batteries very often. That's a very taxing profile that degrades the batteries and reduces their lifespan. But in stationary applications, we don't see that kind of demand profile, that kind of utilization profile. Instead, we see that the batteries can be maintained at a level of charge that can extend their life enormously. And research, for example, by Jeff Dunn's team has shown that lithium-ion batteries can, even existing technologies, not the ones that are in the labs that are showing even more longevity, but the existing ones we already have, when they are stress tested within the range that we would expect in stationary applications, they don't get 500 cycles. They get tens of thousands of cycles before they're significantly degraded. So this is another perhaps that you could call it a myth in the discourse, in the energy discourse right now. And in reality, the stationary batteries, so, at a small scale, like the Tesla power walls of people's garages, or at a very large scale, the grid scale installations, those are likely to last decades. So that's the first question, the question about longevity. The question about resource use, there's no question, there's no denying that resources are going to be required to build out an entirely new energy system. That's a fact. The question to answer is, what is the actual scale of that resource footprint look like in absolute terms, and what does it look like compared to the existing energy system's footprint? Okay, well, in absolute terms, the scale is not that large. The mining and the materials acquisition we would have to have in order to build out this system would have a footprint much smaller than, for example, other industries like the cement industry or the iron and steel industry, or indeed the fossil fuel industry, especially coal. So the amount of mining that we would need to do to build 100% solar, wind, and batteries for the world is comparable or smaller than the amount of mining we do today just for coal. And then the second thing to keep in mind is, once you've built this system, it becomes a standing stock of assets. Unlike coal, which you have to keep mining because you burn the fuel up. Once you build these solar plants, once you build the batteries, and you build out the new system, then you have that initial spike of resource requirements drops down to a maintenance level, which is much lower. And that maintenance level would be a tiny fraction of the footprint of today's energy system with fossil fuels. And don't forget, mining for uranium and for nuclear power and the rest of the energy footprint. So the answer to both of those questions is that the picture is much brighter than you might be led to believe if you listen to certain voices in the energy space.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's assume for the moment that we could persuade the politicians in San Diego County to move forward, or to facilitate our moving forward. Is it possible to adapt your models easily to look at there's two parts of this question? First, the specific cost and deployment steps for San Diego County, and then second, doesn't it make more sense to include the whole state and even in larger geographies, so that in fact, even though your model doesn't address crossing state boundaries, there are certainly efficiencies. Last summer we had fires in Northern California and power systems were out. Well, we were doing fine here in the South, so to speak. But those kinds of conditions will continue, or will persist. There will be times when some geography is under stress and could well be supported by energy from another geography.
But there's absolutely no question that scale certainly comes with advantages. That is absolutely certain, and that is as you well pointed out. The larger the scale, the more that the noise of climatic conditions, of weather and so forth, the more that noise washes out, cancels out across a larger system. So the bigger of a system you can build, and the larger area the larger net that you can cast with solar and wind power, the less you're likely to be to see great dips and spikes in the availability of energy, and that you're going to have to then buffer with battery capacity. And so on the one hand, it absolutely would make sense to go big with solar, wind, and batteries, no question about it. There would certainly be advantages there. However, in purely practical terms, the question to ask is, what does the beginning, what does this early stage of the disruption look like in deployment terms? And what we expect, and again, this is based on previous disruptions, what we see in other instances of technology disruption, what we see is that there will be experiments run by regions, by communities, by individual companies, even by entire countries, and they will embrace the new technology sooner and more enthusiastically than others. And they will experiment with the new system, with new business models that are based on it, with new policy and planning around it. And if they succeed, then their example will serve as something that other regions can follow. And so this is a crucial part and a healthy part of disruption in general, because we don't know exactly in advance what the optimal path looks like through the disruption. We need to run all of these experiments, and we need to learn from them as quickly as possible, so that the successes can be embraced and replicated by others. And the final thing to say about this, which is an equity and a justice issue, is that again, this is borne out by previous disruptions of many different kinds, everything from medical technologies to the internet. Local communities and regions, it can feel as if you're alone. It can feel as if you're isolated, as if when you're looking at disruption and you're deciding what to do. It can feel like there's no support. You're blazing the trail and taking all of the risks and carrying all of that uncertainty. And so it's important to emphasize that no community will truly be alone in this process. There will be allies. There will be allies all over the world for this. Once we start running these experiments and start learning from one another and building upon one another's successes and learning to avoid one another's failures. If we adopt that mindset, if we adopt the mindset of experimentation and of learning, then and of community, of doing this, the mindset that we're in this together, and that you can have a partner in a neighboring region or in another country, or two cities on opposite sides of the world could be partners in this disruption. And so that's very important to keep in mind, that San Diego and or smaller cities or larger regions, you're not alone. And we can run these experiments and find the successes together. And that really is the way forward. The winners that have emerged in past disruptions have done exactly that. And we would be wise to do the same in this one, especially with this one.
So Dr. Dorr, I appreciate that answer. That sort of addresses something that Rob H. asked about, which had more to do with rooftop solar and our net metering debates that were going on right now for an M3 policy. And so Rob H., I just want to acknowledge your question, and we do appreciate that. I hope folks are following that. There is an equity issue with rooftop solar and rooftop solar rebates, and how do we defray those costs that the power company continues to have to extend, and then arguably to people who cannot afford or do not have rooftop solar. So, but I want to move on because I don't think that's really a question for Dr. Dorr for you to answer specifically. I think you're talking more about utility solar here, as opposed to trying to figure out how to do it rooftop by rooftop. That's kind of another issue, and we all need to think our way through that. But my next question for you is from Mark D, and also Dr. Tom asked a similar question. What is your view on hydrogen generation and storage versus lithium batteries? Did you assess that and try to figure out whether that made more sense?
So with hydrogen, our current position, and this is always subject to change as new data comes in, but our current position on the issue, on the question of hydrogen, is that we see its potential as being limited, and its requirements as being the barriers to it forming a large part of the new energy system being substantial. So let me explain that in a little bit of detail. So fundamentally, the energy pathway for utilizing hydrogen as a storage medium, which is what it is fundamentally less efficient than direct electrification and the use through batteries. And this is not in question. This is simply a fact. So then the follow-on question to ask from that is, despite its lower efficiency, which may be a factor of 3 or something like that compared to batteries, depending on the specific application, despite having its lower efficiency, is the economic case strong enough for hydrogen that it overwhelms that limitation? And the answer to that question, in the context of our research, in the context of superpower, and in the context of the clean energy U curve, is the outlook there is more bleak for hydrogen than other analyses have suggested. And the reason why is that hydrogen looks like a viable alternative for long-term energy storage, what's sometimes called seasonal storage. But that's predicated on the assumption that you need seasonal storage. And what our research shows is that you don't need a month worth of battery energy storage. You only need a few days worth if you design the system correctly and optimize, basically build more solar and wind generating capacity to reduce your energy storage requirements. So that's one important factor, is that without the need for long-term energy storage, the utility of hydrogen as an alternative but more expensive, or at least fundamentally more inefficient storage mechanism, is not there. So that's the first thing to consider. The second aspect of the hydrogen question to consider is what are the barriers to introducing that system? And there, I mean, primarily the infrastructure requirements. So right now we do not have a hydrogen infrastructure, and we have reason to believe, although there's some movement on this in research, we have every reason to believe that a hydrogen infrastructure would be expensive to build and would be expensive to maintain. The nature of hydrogen is such that it is more difficult to manage than, say, for example, methane or natural gas. It requires more expensive equipment and more costly maintenance to keep it updated and to keep it functioning. Hydrogen is a difficult gas to work with for a number of reasons. Now, because of that, there's a large infrastructure requirement, combined together with its inefficiency, then you have a situation where how do you scale the system, a hydrogen system, sufficiently? How do you build a system of sufficient scale to give you economies of scale to lower the cost to a point that's competitive with other storage options, namely with batteries and electrification? And as far as we can tell, it's very difficult to do that. When you run all of those numbers, it looks like it would be much more expensive to build a hydrogen system than a direct electrification system. The exceptions here are a handful of niche applications, right? Aviation is one. For the time being, long-haul trucking, so very long truck trips, are another where it might make sense to use hydrogen fuel cells instead of batteries. Another example is the utilization of hydrogen as a heating fuel for combustion instead of for electricity generation. And then you would be competing with batteries that would require the electrification of processes like industrial processes and so forth. But even still, it looks like, from our perspective, that the combination of superpower and lithium-ion batteries, together with electrifying industry and heating, and would not leave a whole lot of room, would not leave a large enough space for hydrogen to really grow to where it would need to be economically competitive. So that's a long answer, and I hope a thorough answer to our position on hydrogen, which is that it's unlikely to be economically competitive, and it's unlikely to be necessary relative to superpower combined with lithium-ion batteries, or indeed future battery technologies that will come.
Wow, thank you. Mike B says the fly in the ointment around electrification is that cars last 15 years or more, and the internal combustion engines are still being sold, and they emit more greenhouse gases than any other category. What role can superpower play in helping us address the transportation question and the vehicle question?
So this is a great question, and it is a superb invitation for me to point to our other research, particularly the transportation disruption that's coming. So our research is not limited to energy. Energy is part of what we've looked at, but there are equally extraordinary disruptions that are going to take place simultaneously over the next 10 to 15 years in the transportation sector and also in the food sector. And we have research reports published on both of those as well. So for transportation, the disruption that's coming is being driven by three technologies. The electrification is just one of them. The other two technologies, and if you'll recall from my presentation, the convergence of multiple technologies is often what triggers a disruption. What we have is not just the electrification of vehicles, but also the emergence of autonomous vehicles that can drive themselves. And despite a predictable hype cycle where over the last 3 or 4 years, we got very excited about autonomous vehicles, and some bullish voices who suggested they might be just around the corner, we were never really imagining that they would arrive by 2020 or 2021. We were always, people watching this space closely, were always thinking mid-2020s for the arrival of a mature autonomous vehicle technology. But once we have that, and there's every reason to believe that autonomous vehicles will be deployed before 2025 in most areas that can support them. In other words, places where their quality of the roads is reasonably high and under most circumstances. So not where I live in Michigan, and we're not talking about a snowstorm in the middle of winter on the road full of potholes, 200 yards down from my house. We're not talking about having to drive in those conditions, but we're talking about driving in 99% of the rest of the time. That technology is right around the corner. Okay. The third technology is transportation as a service. We have pre-transportation as a service. We call it TaaS, T-A-A-S, transportation as a service. We have pre-TaaS right now. That's Uber and Lyft. That's ride-hailing technology. This is where you don't need to own a vehicle. You just use transportation as a service. When you put these three together, you get a transformative impact. You have electric vehicles, which are will eventually be significantly cheaper, and certainly cheaper to operate than gasoline vehicles because they require no fuel. They will run longer. You can put 1 million miles in an electric drivetrain, and it's difficult to do that with a combustion engine vehicle. They will drive themselves, and the bulk of the cost in ride hailing and taxi services is the driver. And more and more, we are seeing that there's an enormous appetite for transportation as a service, as opposed to private ownership of vehicles. This is going to be turbocharged when the cost of transportation as a service is slashed by a factor of 5 or more as a result of autonomy. When you put these together, what you have is a value proposition that is overwhelmingly competitive, right? So when you can have a car that drives itself, even if you insist on owning it yourself and you don't use transportation as a service, when the cars can drive themselves, the cars that can't will be worthless. And it won't be, we will be shocked how quickly people abandon perfectly good cars because they don't have a chauffeur built into them. and the value of having a vehicle that can drive itself, and the value both in practical terms and in financial terms of being able to save money with transportation as a service will drive many people to abandon vehicle owners. That we will see vehicles simply sitting in driveways or heading to the scrapyard, and the used car market is in deep trouble. And there are many, many knock-on effects from this. There's going to be a glut of steel, for example, from all of this, the fleet of internal combustion engines that are rendered worthless. So this is going to be a textbook example of stranded assets. Vehicles that we have today that run on gasoline and diesel that can't drive themselves will be absolutely worthless. They will have negative value. People will be struggling to get rid of them. Once you can avail yourself of an electric vehicle that really can drive itself, and that you don't have to buy to utilize, that you can pull out your smartphone and get rides from. That is going to be completely transformative. And one more thing that I'll add is that we had a tremendous response to the transportation report that we published, and there are entire nations that are planning their transportation future in the long run based on exactly this, the electric autonomous transportation as a service future. So this is being taken very seriously. This is the model that is going to come. And again, just over the next 10 to 15 years, simultaneously with the energy disruption.
Thank you. Next question that we have was from Jose, and he asked, if we adopt distributed energy resources and vehicle to grid, would there be less superpower? And then a follow-up question also was, did the report assume upgrades to the transmission infrastructure?
Good questions. So, so to the first question, the dynamics are very complicated, and they're region dependent and geography dependent. So depending on many of those factors, when you deploy distributed energy resources, whether or not the surplus, particularly from solar power, is the same. In other words, whether you get the same amount of superpower is an open question. It's difficult to say definitively one way or another what all systems will look like. In principle, solar paired with batteries will have the same underlying, and wind as well, although not as many people have a wind turbine on their property, individuals or businesses. So think solar and batteries. Even if they're distributed and smaller scale, you're still going to be in a situation where the system would need to be able to meet electricity demand when circumstances are at their most challenging. In other words, during the short, cloudy days of winter. And because of that, the location and the scale of the batteries and solar panels that exist is secondary, right? You are going to have the same requirements of the system, regardless of whether all the panels are concentrated at grid scale or whether they're distributed. That's fundamental, but the details matter on the ground. If you have a more efficient system, because it is decentralized and people are putting what they need where they need it, then and if you had a system where if you'll recall the list of assumptions that we made that were constraining, that were challenges to our analysis, if we relax some of those, which distributed energy resources would allow people to buy and sell and trade electricity, allow imports, allow demand shifting and energy arbitrage, if we allow some of those things, the total capacity of the system would not need to be as large. And as the capacity declines, well, then naturally superpower output would decline as well. So this is a push and a pull situation. And but we have every reason to believe that the underlying dynamic remains, that you have to have the solar panels and the batteries to get through the tough parts of the year. And by virtue of having those for the rest of the year, you have a surplus. And so you would have an enormous amount of superpower. Whether it's a little bit more or a little bit less, that is going to depend on the specifics. The second question, remind me the second question. It was
It was about, did you assume in the report that you would need upgrades to the transmission infrastructure?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. The transmission infrastructure was something that we held constant. And this, again, is, it's dependent on factors like to what extent are we rolling out distributed energy resources, and what are the geographic requirements, and what are new business models that are emerging. Some new infrastructure is very likely to be required, but it's likely to be less than is, what's a better way to put it? Right now, the incumbency is being, shall we say, hyperbolic about the requirements that this new system would place on infrastructure. And we don't need 4 times as much infrastructure just because we would have 4 times as much generating capacity. We aren't in a situation where there would be proportional 1-to-1 requirements like that. Instead, the new system, especially if a large fraction of it is distributed, could be much more intelligently managed, and we would have far less stress on the system with new tech, in particular with batteries, than we do currently, because batteries are so much better at providing ancillary services, the grid stabilization services, meeting spikes, preventing providing voltage and frequency control, much better at black start and instantaneous responses. All of these peak points of stress on the existing infrastructure, they are parts of they are features of the existing infrastructure that these new technologies mollify quite a bit. And so it's a lazy assumption to say, well, if we build more generating capacity, we're going to need a proportionately large amount of additional infrastructure. That is not the case. Will we need some? Yes, almost certainly. We will. There may be exceptions. There may be locations. There may be experiments run in some regions that find that they can reduce their infrastructure requirements if they're intelligent enough about it. So I shouldn't even say that there will be some new infrastructure requirements. It's likely, but we may discover some surprises there. But what I can say definitively is that those requirements are probably not going to be onerous, and certainly not as onerous as the incumbency is saying that they will be.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty fair. I know in talking to our local transportation system gurus, they're thinking about parking all their electric buses in the same depot. And clearly, they've got concerns about, we've been told by the power company that can't happen. And so it just means we'll rethink that strategy. You shouldn't park them all in the same place. So yeah, we do have to be a little bit flexible in how we abuse the new grid. Joe, did you have another question, or should I go ahead?
Yeah, no, I've got one here. Different direction now. Merrill asks, or makes this statement. He says, newly appointed Deputy Director of Energy Justice in the Department of Energy, Shalonda Baker, is adamant that a successful transition to 100% renewables won't be possible without eliminating energy injustices. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, energy and other environmental justice challenges are crucial. They're inextricable from climate change and from other environmental issues and from other social challenges that we face. So I, at least in principle, disentangling these, separating them is it doesn't make sense in principle. And we're going to run into these challenges in practice everywhere we step. There's no question. So I think although our analysis is it's fundamentally data driven, and we are an independent think tank and therefore apolitical, I think that there is simply no question that distributive issues, justice and equity issues, they are central concerns to how to run the experiments and find out how to embrace and accelerate the disruption of energy and arrive at a 100% clean decarbonized energy system as soon as possible. We can't do that unless we address these other challenges. The good news here, there are two important things to keep in mind here. The good news is that the technologies that we're talking about are fundamentally democratizing. And the reason why is because they are viable at scales that the incumbent technologies simply aren't. You can't put a small coal power plant anywhere. I mean, you can wear a solar and battery system on your wrist, right? Or you can build a solar and battery system that's 2 gigawatts and everything in between. You cannot do that with coal, with natural gas, with diesel generators, or with nuclear power even. So we have the opportunity to deploy these technologies at every different scale, and that is going to fundamentally alter the dynamics of them. And so even though our analysis is focused on the grid scale, the larger scale, this is where it comes back down to the distributed energy resources, and the disruption is going to occur at every scale. So that's very encouraging. Because these technologies are available and viable at small scale, they can be embraced and they can be used to level the playing field where it hasn't been leveled, where it hasn't been possible to level it in the past. So that's something that's fundamentally positive and worth getting excited about, but we need to run the experiments on the ground and find out the best way to do these things. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is beyond the local justice scale. This is at the global scale. A common criticism that follows on from this is that these new technologies will widen the gap between wealthy and poor communities and between more developed and less developed countries. And our analysis, our position on this is that is a myth. That's fundamentally false. We have not seen that with technologies disruptions in the past. In general, we see the opposite. Again, we see that the new technologies allow poorer and less developed and more disadvantaged communities. It allows them to leapfrog over barriers to human development that have been in the way because of the failings and the flaws and the limitations of existing technologies and the social and political systems that have ossified around them. And disruptions do two things. They make new technologies available and they build new systems, and they fundamentally open the door to opportunities to leapfrog in development and to close that gap. But more than just that, disruptions represent pivoting points in human history. Suddenly, if a radical part of your life is going to change, which it is in three important ways, not just in energy, but as I've mentioned, in transportation and food as well. But let's just say energy. If energy is going to change in a radical way, suddenly you start rethinking many different assumptions that you've made. And I mean this as an individual, at the individual level, at the community level, and at the national level. And we've all seen this with COVID. A system shock presents an opportunity to reevaluate. And that's exactly what these disruptions are going to do. So in addition to providing new tools, they're also going to open the door to having a fresh perspective on how we deploy and utilize energy in every aspect of our lives. And so those two things together, I think, are fundamental causes for optimism about the future of human development. And you'll recall from my last slide, clean energy, these energy technologies, they have attributes that do nothing but advance our opportunities for achieving human development goals at every level. So it's worth getting excited about. It's worth being optimistic about. But we can't be complacent. We have to run the experiments. We have to try things out. We have to be diligent and persistent and figure out what works, and then learn from one another's successes and failures. But we have every reason to expect that this is going to be an opportunity to close the gaps that exist between individuals, communities, and entire nations, for sure.
So, Dr. Dorr, when I was reading through your report, my market solutions radar was going a little gangbusters. I personally have a lot of concern about using the market approach, or at least relying on it. And one of the things that I guess I thought of right off the bat was watching OPEC and the nations that produce oil in the past have swung very swiftly to lower their prices in response to any market disruption from their sale of oil. So they see something like electric cars impacting their business. They can drop oil to 45 cents a gallon if they need to. And they can do that for 6 months if they recognize that it's an existential threat to their entire business. And that could really, shake things up just around the time that the automotive companies are thinking they're going to do that, or maybe the northeastern section are replacing other oil burners for heating oil. And suddenly, there's really no reason to do that because OPEC steps in. Did your research look at the possible opponents to the disruption?
Well, certainly. And in particular, we examined in our transportation research, we've looked at the implications for the oil sector. And again, so let me say two things. The first is that the energy industry and the energy sector are unusual in that they're so large and they are so fundamental, right? So energy is part of certainly the majority of the value chains of the world's industries. Energy is in everything, and it's vital, it's essential to everything. So that's different than digital cameras, for example. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, however, we have seen fundamental disruptions in the past, and the incumbents always seem like invincible titans, and they act like it. And then they crumble, and they crumble with astonishing swiftness. And so we've seen this in the past before. We've seen it in the energy sector. The electricity itself was a disruption. Electric lighting was a disruption. And these things happen very, very swiftly. We've seen it in transportation. We've seen it in information technology and communications, especially. And so we don't have any historical precedent for thinking that an industry's size or its political influence can shelter it, can protect it, can save it from disruption perpetually. We have never seen that. So on the one hand, there's no doubt that the existing industry is very large and does wield significant political influence, and they can make things difficult, no question about it. And if we make poor choices as societies, we could allow the incumbency to slow the disruption down substantially, or years. But our analysis from those causal feedback diagrams and the loss of social license and the emergence of public pressures and the loss of government support and these other dynamics, they are a corrosive force that history tells us is inexorable. There's no escape for the oil and gas industry. Disruption's coming for them. It's not a matter of if, judging by history. It is only a matter of when. But that when is important, especially when the clock is ticking on climate change, and especially when the timing depends on the decisions we make. Now, my concern is that America, specific regions in the United States and the country as a whole, my concern is that we could be left behind here. We could find ourselves making poor decisions and seeing other allies and rivals around the world making good decisions and winning in this disruption instead of us. And so that's my main concern. I'm not as concerned that the fossil fuel industry will be able to fend off clean energy forever, or even very long. Although a delay of a decade is a lot because of climate change especially. But what I'm concerned about is that we will not lead this. And we should, and we can. But we need leadership at every level of government, every level of society, and we need it in markets and private industry, as well as public and the nonprofit sector as well. We need it everywhere, and if we don't have it everywhere, we're going to see ourselves losing, and that would be a real shame. We could lead on this, and we should.
Thank you so much. Speaking of the clock is ticking, Dr. Dorr, I just noticed that it's about 10:21 or 10:22 p.m. in Michigan, and I didn't realize earlier that you were actually going to be joining us from Michigan, but I did notice as the sun was setting significantly before us here on the West Coast that you were not in Northern California as I thought. I want to say that this is an extraordinarily robust and provocative discussion, and I really hate to put the brakes on it. And I have to say that your exuberant optimism is super contagious, and we very, very much appreciate you being here, even at this late hour. I think we want to turn it over for a moment to our secretary, Madame Secretary Marion CDO.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dorr. We at NCCCA greatly appreciate the fact that you were willing to stay up late with us and share your expertise with us. And so we have bought a tree in your honor, and it will be planted in a forest area here in California that has been burnt by our recent wildfires. And it's really awesome because you'll be able to go online and find out what tree is specifically yours and keep track of it. So again, greatly appreciate you and thank you so much.
That is a wonderful and a very thoughtful gift. I really do appreciate that. Let me thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you and to share our work. And let me just take one moment to advocate to everybody on the note of optimism to please, if you're interested and if you found our research about energy to be exciting and to be a source of optimism and perhaps a new perspective on climate change, please do have a look at our other research. The implications for climate change in particular of the disruption of transportation and of the disruption of food are every bit as thrilling. And in the case of food, really quite stunning for the environment as a whole, environmental issues as a whole, and in particular for climate change. So please do have a look at those. If you found this interesting at all, I promise you will find that research fascinating and absolutely cause for optimism as well. And I will end by saying, please do stay tuned. Our next major research report, which we are hoping to publish in 4 or 5 weeks, is centered on climate change. So that will be our next major piece of research. So please keep an eye out for that as well. And with that, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
I'm going to keep the window open for just another moment or two if anybody wants to download the chat file. And remember that if you want to share this extraordinary event, it will be posted to our YouTube page within about 24 to 48 hours. Thanks, everybody.
Meryl, do you want to give a plug for next month? Because we couldn't see the visual on the lead-in.
Absolutely. We're going to be hosting a great new virtual movie night of the new award-winning documentary River's End. And we're going to be culminating that with a panelist event on the 8th of July, including a representative of a major water district here in San Diego County, along with major players from the film, and hopefully some other panelists who represent the very tenuous and difficult situation that we're going to be in over the next several decades in regard to our water acquisition. So please stay tuned for next month's event, and thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.